29 years old and still unchosen. Lysette's laughter cut through the dressing chamber like shattered crystal, while dozens of young noble women adjusted their gowns behind silk curtains. The scent of rosewater and warm powder filled the air as maids rushed between mirrors, tightening ribbons, and pressing final creases from satin skirts before the bride selection began. Siren Ashgrove stood alone near the far window, away from the excitement, smoothing the front of the only gown she had been permitted for tonight. Pale gray silk without embroidery, no pearls, no gemstones stitched along the bodice, but it was clean and carefully pressed, and she had spent 2 weeks adjusting the sleeves herself so the fabric would fall properly beneath candlelight. Then she turned away from the mirror for barely a moment. When she looked back, dark red wine bled across the entire front of her gown. The stain spread from the neckline downward, across the bodice and waist, like ink spreading across parchment. Siren's breath stopped completely. Behind her, Jorvain examined her own reflection with studied calm, while a near-empty wineglass rested in her left hand. Lisette covered her smile behind a lace fan, though her shoulders trembled with barely contained amusement. "What a shame," Jorvain murmured without looking away from her own reflection. "Someone should be more careful with their wine." Several other women nearby exchanged glances but said nothing. Nobody would risk offending Lord Westcott Ashgrove's daughters during the most important social gathering of the decade. Siren stared at the ruined fabric while humiliation pressed through her chest with physical weight. Months of careful preparation destroyed in a single motion designed to look accidental. Lysette leaned closer, her whisper sharp beneath the fan. "You cannot walk into that hall looking like a scullery maid, sister. Perhaps the kindest thing would be to simply stay behind tonight." Siren's fingers trembled against the soaked fabric. For several agonizing seconds she stood completely still, while noise and laughter swirled around her and tears pressed dangerously behind her eyes. Then she did something nobody in that room expected. She removed the outer silk layer entirely revealing the simple linen underdress beneath, without mirrors, without assistance, and without a single word spoken to either sister. She adjusted the plain fabric across her shoulders, tucked the edges neatly against her waist, and straightened her posture until the garment fell with a dignity that owed nothing to decoration. Jorvain's smirk faded. Lysette lowered her fan. From the opposite side of the dressing chamber, partially hidden behind a marble column near the entrance reserved for the selection committee, a man stood watching in complete silence. Duke Theron Blackmere had arrived early through a private corridor to observe the candidates before the formal introductions began. His expression revealed nothing readable. But his eyes had not moved from Siren Ashgrove since the wineglass tilted. He had seen everything. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and powerful vindication, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. Ashgrove Hall stood among the oldest aristocratic estates in the northern counties, built from gray limestone that turned almost silver beneath winter sunlight. Tall windows lined every corridor, overlooking gardens that stretched toward ancient oak forests and a narrow river that curved behind the property before disappearing into the hills. Inside, polished wooden floors reflected firelight from enormous marble hearths, while portraits of 7 generations of Ashgrove ancestors watched from gilded frames along the grand staircase. Everything about the estate whispered wealth, tradition, and reputation, and every room inside it reminded Siren Ashgrove that she no longer belonged. At 29 years old, unmarried, and without a single remaining prospect willing to endure her father's scrutiny, Siren had become the family's unspoken failure. She was not mentioned during introductions. She was not seated beside important guests during supper. When visitors asked Lord Westcott how many children blessed his household, he answered 3, although 4 had been born beneath that roof. Her mornings began before dawn. While her sisters slept beneath embroidered quilts and warmed breakfast trays appeared beside their beds carried by patient maids. Siren moved through the lower corridors, checking deliveries with the kitchen steward, reviewing household expenses that Lady Davinia found tedious, and settling disputes between servants before they reached her mother's attention. She balanced the weekly accounts, supervised linen inventories, managed correspondence with tradesmen across 3 counties, and ensured the estate functioned with the precision her family demanded, but never acknowledged. Nobody thanked her for any of it. One gray Tuesday morning, while arranging fresh flowers inside the drawing room before guests arrived for afternoon tea, Siren overheard Lady Davinia speaking with a visiting cousin in the adjoining parlor. Westcott refuses to discuss her prospects any further. Lady Davinia sighed. Honestly, I cannot blame him. Every eligible gentleman within reasonable distance has already declined. At her age, even widowers hesitate. The cousin murmured something sympathetic. She is useful around the household, Lady Davinia continued. I suppose we should be grateful for that much. Siren placed the last stem of lavender into the vase without making a sound. Her hands remained perfectly steady, though the air around her seemed to tighten until breathing required effort. That same week, while reviewing the estate's quarterly accounts inside the steward's office, Siren discovered a series of errors in the grain supply ledger that had been quietly inflating costs for over a year. The discrepancies totaled nearly £400, a sum large enough to fund a tenant family's living expenses for 3 seasons. She corrected the figures methodically, identified the dishonest supplier, and presented her findings to Lord Westcott's estate manager, with documentation precise enough to recover the lost funds within a month. Lord Westcott praised the estate manager publicly during supper for his diligent oversight. The manager accepted the compliment without correcting him. Siren, seated at the far end of the table, continued eating, without expression. Later that same afternoon, while carrying pressed tablecloths through the servants' corridor, she found young Brennan, the stable-boy's son, sitting alone on the back steps crying into his sleeves. The child was barely 7 years old, small for his age, with mud streaked across his face and a torn shirt hanging loosely from one shoulder. Siren knelt beside him immediately. "What happened, sweetheart?" The boy hiccuped through his tears. "Master Gervain's guest kicked his horse and the horse threw me when I tried to calm it down. He said it was my fault and that my father would be dismissed if I told anyone." Siren studied the bruise forming across the child's arm. Anger tightened inside her chest, though her voice remained gentle. "Your father will not be dismissed. I will speak with the guest myself. And we are going to clean that bruise properly before it swells further." She brought the boy into the kitchen, washed his arm with cool water, wrapped it with soft cloth, and gave him warm bread with honey from the pantry before walking directly toward the guest wing. Whatever words she exchanged with the visiting gentleman behind closed doors remained private, but the man departed Ashgrove Hall before supper without explanation. Lord Westcott never learned the reason. Brennan's father discovered it weeks later through kitchen gossip and wept beside the stables that evening. He never forgot what Siren Ashgrove had done for his son. Small kindnesses like these lived throughout the estate. Servants knew. Siren remembered their children's names. She asked after sick relatives. She brought meals personally to elderly household workers, too proud to admit they could no longer manage the stairs. During harsh winters, she arranged extra blankets for staff quarters without recording the expense anywhere her mother might question it. None of this mattered to the world beyond the servants' corridor. During Sunday church visits, women her mother's age studied Siren with open pity while whispering behind gloved hands. "She was lovely once," one murmured after the sermon while Siren walked past without flinching. Certainly she was. But loveliness fades when no man confirms it. At a neighbor's garden luncheon several weeks later, a younger woman turned to her companion and gestured toward Siren with casual cruelty. "My mother says the Ashgrove eldest simply frightened every suitor away with too many opinions. Men want softness, not lectures about estate management. Both women laughed. Siren continued eating her soup without expression. Pain had become something she wore so constantly that she barely noticed the weight of it anymore, the way a person stops feeling the pressure of shoes worn since morning until they finally sit down at night and realize their feet have been aching for hours. Only in the evenings, after the household settled into silence and candlelight flickered against her bedroom walls, did she allow herself to feel the full measure of loneliness pressing against her. She would sit beside the window, overlooking the darkened gardens, brushing her hair while the wind moved through the oak trees, and wonder whether invisibility was something that happened gradually, or whether it arrived all at once, and she had simply failed to notice the exact moment it began. One evening, Nella, the elderly maid who had served Siren since childhood, entered bearing chamomile tea and a plate of shortbread. "You barely touched supper again," Nella said, while setting the tray beside the bed. "I was not particularly hungry." Nella studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You hold this house together, child. And not one soul under this roof has the decency to notice." Siren smiled faintly. "You noticed." The old maid sat down beside her without being invited, something she only ever did when the door was safely closed. "That is precisely why it angers me." The letter arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, brought by a royal courier in dark blue livery, trimmed with silver thread. Lord Westcott received it personally inside his study, breaking the heavy wax seal with unusual care before reading the contents twice in complete silence. Within the hour, the entire household knew. Duke Theron Blackmere, the wealthiest and most powerful unmarried nobleman in England, had formally announced a bride selection. Invitations had been sent to 23 noble families across the northern and central counties, requesting that all unmarried daughters of eligible age present themselves at Thornhaven Castle over 3 days of formal gatherings, private introductions, and a grand concluding ball where the Duke intended to announce his choice publicly. The name Blackmere alone would have caused excitement, but the scale of this invitation sent aristocratic households into a frenzy that bordered on collective madness. Within days, dressmakers across London were overwhelmed with urgent commissions. Fabric merchants reported shortages of French silk, Venetian lace, and Indian muslin, as families competed to outspend one another, preparing gowns spectacular enough to capture a duke's attention. Inside Ashgrove Hall, the atmosphere shifted violently. Lady Davinia abandoned every other concern and devoted herself entirely to transforming Jorvain and Lisette into irresistible candidates. Seamstresses arrived from York within 2 days, carrying bolts of ivory satin, blush-colored silk, and pale gold organza that shimmered like liquid sunlight when unrolled across the drawing-room tables. Jorvain received 3 new gowns. Lisette demanded 4 and received them. Matching gloves, embroidered shawls, jeweled hairpins, imported perfume from Paris, and hand-painted fans arrived in wooden boxes almost daily. The household budget strained visibly, but Lord Westcott authorized every expense without hesitation. A Blackmere marriage would elevate this family beyond anything 3 generations of Ashgroves have achieved, he declared at breakfast while reviewing tailor invoices. "This opportunity will not be wasted." Jorvain straightened proudly. She was 25, sharp-featured and ambitious, with dark auburn hair she wore pinned severely against her neck, in the style favored by London's political wives. Men found her attractive but slightly intimidating. She compensated by studying every piece of political gossip available and rehearsing responses to likely conversation topics days before any social event. Lisette required no preparation of that kind. At 22, she possessed effortless beauty that made effort itself seem unnecessary. Golden-haired, with wide blue eyes, and a laugh designed to fill crowded rooms, she had already refused 2 proposals from men she considered beneath her expectations. The bride selection represented exactly the kind of opportunity she believed she deserved. Nobody mentioned Siren until the second week of preparation. It was Nella who raised the subject first, approaching Lady Davinia cautiously one afternoon, while the household buzzed with fitting appointments and menu discussions. The invitation specifies all unmarried daughters. My lady, Miss Siren remains unmarried. Lady Davinia's expression tightened as though someone had mentioned an unpleasant odor drifting through the room. She glanced toward Lord Westcott, who lowered his newspaper. A long silence followed. She may attend, Lord Westcott said finally, but I will not waste resources outfitting her for an outcome that will never materialize. She may wear something appropriate from what she already owns. Lady Davinia nodded with visible relief. Gervain and Lisette exchanged a glance across the breakfast table that held equal measures of amusement and contempt. That afternoon, while her sisters stood surrounded by seamstresses adjusting hemlines and debating between pearl buttons and diamond clasps, Sirena sat alone in her bedroom examining the contents of her wardrobe. 3 suitable evening gowns hung before her. 2 were several seasons outdated. The third, a pale gray silk she had purchased 2 years earlier for a neighbor's wedding, remained in reasonable condition and could be altered to appear modestly presentable. She spent the following evenings working on it alone after the household retired, adjusting the sleeves, pressing the fabric with heated irons, removing a small stain near the hem, using diluted vinegar and patience. The work was tedious and solitary, but Siren approached it with the same discipline she brought to everything. Meanwhile, her responsibilities inside the estate doubled without discussion. Lady Davinia expected Siren to coordinate all travel arrangements for the family's journey to Thornhaven Castle. Luggage organization, carriage scheduling, wardrobe packing for Gervain and Lisette, correspondence with the Duke's household regarding accommodation assignments, dietary requirements, and arrival protocols. Every detail passed through Siren's hands while her sisters spent their days selecting jewelry and practicing dance steps. You will ensure their trunks are packed precisely according to this list, Lady Davinia instructed one morning, handing Siren 3 pages of handwritten requirements without looking at her directly. Gervain requires lavender sachets between each garment layer. Lisette insists her gowns remain hanging during transport, so you will need to arrange the larger carriage accordingly. Yes, Mother, and please confirm the supper menu with the Duke's kitchen steward. Gervain cannot tolerate shellfish, and Lisette refuses anything containing visible garlic. Siren took the list calmly. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that her mother spoke to her with exactly the same tone she used when addressing the head housekeeper: professional, efficient, entirely without warmth. 3 days before departure, Siren worked past midnight folding tissue between layers of her sister's gowns while rain hammered against the manor windows. Her fingers ached from pressing delicate fabric, and exhaustion weighed heavily behind her eyes. From the corridor outside, she heard Lysette's voice drifting carelessly through the partially open door of the adjoining bedroom. Honestly, bringing Siren is embarrassing enough. Imagine standing beside her during introductions before the Duke. People will assume the Ashgroves have nothing left worth presenting alongside their best. Gervain's response was quieter but equally sharp. Let her come. She will fade into the background as she always does. The Duke will not glance twice at a woman nearly 30 wearing a gown older than half the servants in this household. Laughter followed. Light and careless and completely unaware that Siren knelt barely 15 feet away, her hands frozen against silk that would never belong to her, breathing slowly through the familiar ache of being discussed, like furniture too old to display but too functional to discard. She finished packing their trunks without a single crease out of place. Nobody checked whether her own bag was ready. Nobody asked if she needed anything for the journey. The morning the carriages departed Ashgrove Hall, beneath pale gray skies, Siren climbed into the second carriage alone, carrying a single modest trunk she had packed herself the previous night. The journey to Thornhaven lasted nearly 6 hours, along rain-softened roads that wound through farmland and forest before climbing toward the northern coast. Inside the first carriage, Jorvain and Lysette discussed strategy with the focused energy of generals preparing for a campaign. Siren heard fragments through the window whenever the carriages drew close along narrow stretches. "He values intelligence," Jorvain declared. "I intend to demonstrate political knowledge no other candidate will match." Lysette laughed dismissively. "Men do not marry political knowledge, Jorvain. They marry the woman who makes them feel most alive in a room. And you believe that woman is you. I believe it has always been me, everywhere I have ever walked." The confidence in Lysette's voice was so complete that even the coachman glanced sideways. Siren leaned back against her seat and watched the countryside blur past the rain-streaked window. Somewhere ahead, Thornhaven Castle waited. And Siren Ashgrove rode toward it with nothing except a carefully mended gown, a lifetime of silence, and the stubborn dignity of a woman who had learned to survive without anyone's help. Long before Siren Ashgrove learned to wear silence like armor, she had been someone entirely different. At 21, she moved through the world with an openness that startled people accustomed to aristocratic restraint. She laughed freely during garden parties, while other young women practiced careful smiles behind painted fans. She debated philosophy with her father's guests when daughters were expected to discuss only needlework and weather. During summer evenings, she played the fortepiano beside open windows, while warm air brought the sound of meadowlarks across the estate grounds, and servants paused their work simply to listen. Men noticed her, not with the breathless urgency Lysette would later inspire, but with something more lasting. Siren possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself through conversation rather than announcing itself across a ballroom. Several families made discreet enquiries about courtship. Lord Westcott entertained 3 of them seriously, before deciding none offered sufficient political advantage to pursue. Then Corwin Hallowell arrived at Ashgrove Hall. A young physician from a respectable but untitled family in Wessex, Corwin had been summoned urgently after a fever swept through the tenant farms along the eastern boundary of the estate. Lord Westcott permitted his presence reluctantly, and only because the outbreak threatened productivity during harvest season. Corwin was expected to treat the workers and leave without troubling the main household. Instead, he stayed for nearly 4 months. The fever proved more stubborn than anyone anticipated, and Corwin worked tirelessly among the tenant cottages, often sleeping beside sick children on straw mattresses when their parents were too ill to watch over them through the night. Servants brought reports of his dedication back to the main house, and it was Siren who first visited the tenant farms to deliver additional blankets and medicine after learning the estate steward had reduced supply shipments to save costs. She found Corwin kneeling beside an elderly woman's bed, spooning broth between cracked lips while speaking in a voice so gentle it stopped Siren in the doorway. Their first real conversation happened that afternoon, beneath an oak tree between the tenant cottages and the main estate. Siren had intended to discuss supply logistics. Instead, they spoke for 2 hours about medical philosophy, the moral obligations of landowners toward workers, and whether grief could physically damage the human heart. Corwin listened to her opinions without surprise or condescension. He asked follow-up questions that proved he was genuinely interested in her answers, rather than merely tolerating them until his turn to speak. Nobody had ever treated her mind as something worth exploring before. By the 2nd month, Siren visited the tenant farms daily. She told her mother she was supervising supply distribution, which was partially true. Lady Davinia never questioned the explanation because she had no interest in the tenants or the effort required to manage them. Corwin and Siren walked together along the river path most afternoons, discussing literature and medicine, while autumn leaves drifted across the water. He lent her books on anatomy and natural science. She shared poetry she had written privately since girlhood, blushing furiously while he read each page with careful attention. One October evening, while rain drummed softly against the library windows, Corwin told her something nobody else had ever said. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life. And it bewilders me that you seem entirely unaware of it." Siren's heart opened so completely in that moment that the memory of it would ache inside her for years afterward. Nella noticed a change immediately. "You are glowing, child," the old maid whispered while brushing Siren's hair one evening. "Your eyes have been dark for months, and suddenly they hold light again. Be careful with whatever has caused it." But Siren was not careful enough. One afternoon, Lord Westcott returned unexpectedly from a business trip to York and found Siren and Corwin walking together through the formal gardens, her hand resting inside his arm while they laughed at something. Only they understood. The expression on Lord Westcott's face drained every trace of warmth from the autumn air. That evening, shouting echoed through the study walls loudly enough for the kitchen staff to hear 2 corridors away. "You are a physician without title, without land, and without a single connection valuable to this family." Lord Westcott's voice held the flat certainty of a man accustomed to having his judgments treated as natural law. "You entered this estate to treat sick laborers. Nothing beyond that was ever offered to you." Corwin stood without flinching. "I love your daughter sincerely, and she returns that feeling. Love is irrelevant," Lord Westcott replied. "Love does not protect family legacies. Love does not secure political alliances. Love does not prevent a noble name from being diluted by common association." Siren begged for 3 days. She appealed to her mother privately, desperately, with tears running freely down her face, while Lady Davinia sat motionless beside the bedroom fireplace. "He is a good man, Mother. He is kind and brilliant, and he treats me as though my thoughts matter." Lady Davinia studied her daughter for a long moment before answering. "Your thoughts are not what society values in a wife, Siren. I am sorry. Truly I am. But your father's decision is final." Corwin was ordered to leave Ashgrove Hall within 24 hours. Siren found him at dawn beside the front gate, his medical bag resting against the stone wall, while a hired carriage waited in the gray mist beyond. Rain had not yet started, but the sky pressed low and heavy against the hills as though the weather itself understood what was happening. "I have accepted a position at a hospital near the southern coast," he told her. "It is good work, important work. But I will come back for you, Siren, when I have built enough reputation that even your father cannot dismiss me. I will return." She memorized his face in that moment. The steadiness in his dark eyes, the way his jaw tightened against emotion he refused to release in front of her, because he wanted her last image of him to hold strength rather than sorrow. The carriage disappeared beyond the tree line, and Siren stood at the gate until Nella came to bring her inside. 5 months later, a letter arrived bearing a hospital seal. Siren recognized it immediately, and her hands began shaking before she broke the wax. Corwin Hallowell had died during a cholera outbreak that swept through the port towns surrounding the hospital. He had refused to evacuate with the other physicians, choosing instead to remain beside patients too ill to be moved. He worked until the disease claimed him as well. He died saving strangers, because saving people was simply who he was. Siren read the letter twice. Then, the paper slipped from her fingers onto the bedroom floor, and she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing, while the clock on the mantelpiece continued ticking, as though the world had not just become permanently smaller. She did not leave her room for 6 days. When she finally emerged, the young woman who laughed freely and debated philosophy and played fortepiano beside open windows had disappeared. In her place stood someone more careful and infinitely more guarded. A woman who had learned that loving openly in a world that punished vulnerability was a luxury she could no longer afford. While Siren disappeared into grief that autumn, the rest of the Ashgrove family continued building alliances with the tireless precision of chess players, who believed winning required nothing beyond moving the correct pieces at the correct time. Malis, the second eldest daughter at 27, had married Lord Fenwick Drey the previous spring, in a ceremony Lady Davinia described as flawless to anyone willing to listen. Fenwick possessed a respected family name, a seat in Parliament, and 3 country estates connected by private roads lined with elm trees and stone walls. On paper, the marriage represented everything the Ashgroves valued. Behind closed doors, it had begun unraveling within months. Fenwick treated Malis with the detached courtesy of a man managing a household asset. He acknowledged her presence at meals with brief nods. He answered her questions about his schedule with single sentences delivered without eye contact. Guests were received warmly only when political advantage required it, and the moment the last carriage departed, silence returned to the Drey household like fog settling across an empty field. One evening, several months before the bride selection was announced, Malis sat alone in the dining room of the Drey estate while servants cleared plates from the opposite end of a table built for 14. Fenwick had sent word through a footman that he would take supper in his study. The third such evening that week. The candles burned low while Malis stared at the empty chair across from her and realized she could not remember the last time her husband had asked her a question that required more than a single word in response. She confided in nobody. Admitting unhappiness would mean admitting her parents had been wrong, and the Ashgrove family did not tolerate being wrong about anything. Instead, she visited Ashgrove Hall regularly, dressed expensively, smiling broadly, and criticizing Siren with increasing sharpness as though attacking her unmarried sister could somehow disguise the fractures spreading through her own life. "At least I secured a respectable match," Malis remarked, during a family luncheon while adjusting pearl bracelets that Fenwick had given her in lieu of conversation. "Some women understand their obligations to family." Siren said nothing. She had noticed the way Malis flinched whenever someone mentioned Fenwick's name unexpectedly, the way her laughter held a brittle quality that shattered if examined too closely, but Siren kept her observations private. Nobody inside the Ashgrove household rewarded honesty. During one of these visits, while the bride's selection preparations consumed the household, Malis spent an entire afternoon in Lord Westcott's study, reviewing society newspapers and correspondence from politically connected friends of Fenwick's circle. She had developed an almost obsessive interest in Duke Theron Blackmere's personal history, extracting every available detail about his broken engagement with Lady Rosabelle von Tress, his withdrawal from London society, and the vulnerabilities that gossip attributed to his character. She told Lady Davinia the research was intended to help Jorvain prepare intelligent conversation topics. The truth was less generous. Malis collected information the way a careful person gathers provisions against uncertain weather, not necessarily expecting a storm, but preparing for one regardless. Jorvain, meanwhile, had spent her mid-20s constructing a social reputation built entirely on strategic intelligence. She attended every political dinner within traveling distance, memorized the names of every rising parliamentarian and their wives, and developed conversational techniques designed to make powerful men believe she understood their ambitions deeply, when, in truth, she simply reflected their own opinions back to them with adjusted phrasing. Her ambition was not marriage itself, but the elevation marriage could provide. She wanted influence. She wanted drawing rooms where policy was discussed before it reached Parliament. She wanted to be consulted rather than merely admired. What Jorvain never acknowledged, even privately, was the emptiness that followed her home after every social triumph. The congratulations she received for clever remarks at dinner parties evaporated by morning. The alliances she built never extended into genuine friendship. People respected her usefulness without ever particularly liking her company. Lysette operated by entirely different principles. Where Jorvain calculated, Lisette simply expected. Beauty had functioned as currency throughout her entire life, and she saw no reason to develop alternative resources. At 22, she had already rejected 2 proposals, one from a baronet's eldest son, and another from a wealthy shipping merchant whose family name she considered insufficiently distinguished. Both men had been visibly heartbroken. Lysette felt nothing beyond mild irritation that they had wasted her time. During the weeks of preparation, Lysette studied portraits of Duke Theron Blackmere, obtained from society newspapers, and discussed his physical appearance with her sisters, as though appraising portraits inside a gallery. "Handsome enough," she declared, while examining an engraving over breakfast somewhat severe around the jaw. "But wealth compensates considerably for temperament." Gervain glanced sideways at her youngest sister with undisguised contempt. "If you approach the Duke with nothing beyond physical charm, you will lose to any woman offering genuine substance." Lysette smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had never once been proven wrong by experience. "Substance bores powerful men, Gervain. Beauty holds them." What neither sister understood was that their greatest vulnerabilities were not external rivals or insufficient preparation. The fractures already lived inside them. Gervain's relentless ambition left no space for the emotional warmth genuine partnership required. Lysette's dependence on admiration meant that the first man who withheld it would unravel her completely. And Maëlys had already discovered that securing the perfect match guaranteed nothing about the life that followed. Each sister stood at the peak of her confidence precisely when the foundations beneath her were weakest. And they remained united in only one belief, that Sirène, overlooked, nearly 30 years old, and burdened by a grief none of them had ever bothered to understand, deserved nothing more than the margins she already occupied. Thornhaven Castle stood on a cliff above the North Sea, where the wind never fully stopped, and the sound of waves crashing against black rocks echoed through the corridors, even with every window sealed. Built 3 centuries earlier from dark granite quarried directly from the cliff face, the castle appeared less like a home and more like something the landscape itself had produced through centuries of pressure and erosion. 47 rooms, 11 fireplaces, large enough for a grown man to stand inside. A library containing over 9,000 volumes collected by 6 generations of Blackmere dukes. And at the center of it all, a man who occupied the most powerful private estate in northern England, yet spent most evenings eating supper alone beside a window overlooking water that stretched endlessly toward a horizon he had stopped finding beautiful years ago. Duke Theron Blackmere was 35 years old and already exhausted by the performance society. Demanded of powerful men, he attended parliament sessions when required. He managed shipping investments, agricultural estates, and coal interests across 4 counties with meticulous discipline. He responded to correspondence from politicians seeking support with words that committed him to nothing while offending nobody. But privately, behind the controlled exterior that London society interpreted as either admirable stoicism or unsettling coldness depending on their own interests, Theron had been hollowed out by a betrayal so calculated that even years later it surfaced unexpectedly during moments of stillness, bald too completely. Lady Rosabelle Vantris had entered his life during a parliamentary reception in London 4 years earlier. She was 26 then, elegant without ostentation, intelligent without aggression, and disarmingly warm in private moments that made Theron believe he had finally found someone who valued him beyond the fortune and title attached to his name. Their courtship proceeded carefully. Theron was not a man who trusted easily, and Rosabelle seemed to understand this instinctively. She never pushed for declarations. She never mentioned his estates or income during conversation. She asked about his childhood, his mother, the books he kept beside his bed, and the reason he preferred walking alone along the cliffs each morning before breakfast. For the first time in his adult life, Theron allowed someone behind the walls he maintained against the world. He proposed after 11 months. Rosabelle accepted with tears in her eyes that appeared entirely genuine, and London society celebrated the engagement as though royalty itself had announced a union. Newspapers praised the match. Aristocratic families sent congratulations laced with envy. His mother, Dowager Duchess Anara, expressed cautious approval, while privately studying Rosabelle with the watchful instincts of a woman who had survived 4 decades inside aristocratic society without ever being deceived twice. The truth arrived 3 months before the wedding, delivered not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accident of a misplaced letter. Theron's personal secretary, organizing correspondence for transport between the London townhouse and Thornhaven, accidentally included a sealed envelope addressed to Rosabelle that had been mixed among business documents. The envelope bore no return address. Theron, assuming it contained a wedding-related communication, opened it without suspicion. Inside he found a letter from Lord Caius Pemberton, a political rival whose family had competed against the Blackmares for influence across the northern counties for 2 generations. The contents destroyed everything. Rosabelle had been corresponding with Pemberton for over a year, sharing private details of Theron's business strategies, political positions, and financial vulnerabilities. In exchange, Pemberton had promised that should Theron's shipping investments falter or his political standing weaken, he would offer Rosabelle an alternative match with equivalent wealth and superior social positioning. The letters revealed not merely infidelity, but something colder. Rosabelle had treated the engagement as a speculative investment, hedging against failure by maintaining a secondary option she could exercise if the primary arrangement ceased producing satisfactory returns. The letter that shattered Theron most completely was barely 4 lines, written in Rosabelle's graceful hand, dated just 2 weeks after she had accepted his proposal while crying in his arms. He trusts me entirely now. That is both useful and somewhat pitiable. Caius, you must be patient. The position will clarify itself within the year. Theron read those words sitting alone in his study at 11:30 on a Tuesday evening, while rain struck the windows and a glass of whiskey sat untouched beside his hand. He read them once. Then again. Then he folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer and sat motionless for over an hour while the fire burned down to ash. He never raised his voice during the confrontation with Rosabelle. That disturbed London society more than rage would have. He simply presented the evidence, asked no questions, and informed her that the engagement was dissolved effective immediately. Rosabelle attempted to explain. Then she attempted to deny. Then, when neither strategy produced any visible reaction, she became honest for the first and only time in their relationship. You were never going to be enough on your own, Theron. No single person is. I simply planned. Accordingly. Those words followed him for years afterward, not because they were cruel, but because some part of him suspected they might be true. The public aftermath proved worse than the private devastation. London society devoured the scandal with enthusiasm. Women whispered behind fans at opera performances. Gentlemen exchanged knowing looks across club dining rooms. People who had praised the engagement weeks earlier now competed to appear the most sympathetically outraged, while secretly enjoying the spectacle of a powerful man publicly humiliated. Theron withdrew from society almost completely afterward. Invitations accumulated unopened across his desk. Women continued pursuing him with strategies ranging from subtle to desperate, each approach confirming his growing conviction that affection offered to wealthy men was simply commerce conducted without written contracts. His mother watched the withdrawal with increasing alarm. Anara Blackmere was not a woman given to sentimentality, but she loved her son with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood exactly how isolation could harden around a wounded heart until nothing could penetrate it. The bride selection was her idea. Theron rejected it immediately. Then he rejected it again 3 weeks later. Then a third time, after Honora presented it not as romantic opportunity but as political necessity. "You require an heir," she stated plainly over supper one evening. "Parliament expects stability from the Blackmere seat. Your estates require management that outlives you. And you are 35 years old, sitting alone inside a castle, on a cliff, eating lamb, you have not tasted because you stopped paying attention to food 2 years ago. Theron set down his fork. I am not interested in performing courtship before an audience of ambitious families presenting their daughters like ornaments arranged inside a shop window. Then, do not court them. Observe them. Anora leaned forward with an intensity that demanded attention. You are the most perceptive man I have ever known, Theron. You read contracts others miss entirely. You identify dishonesty in business negotiations before the dishonest party finishes speaking. Apply that same judgment to this. Invite them. Watch them carefully. And if not a single woman among them possesses genuine character worth trusting, then I will never raise the subject again. A long silence settled between them while wind pressed against the castle windows and waves crashed distantly against the rocks below. Theron finally answered without looking at his mother. 3 days. No longer. Anora nodded once. That is all I ask. The invitations went out the following week. 23 families across the northern and central counties. Every one of them responded within days, some within hours, with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. And on the evening before the first carriages were expected to arrive at Thornhaven Castle, Theron stood alone on the cliff path behind the estate, watching the sun sink into dark water while cold wind pulled at his coat. He expected nothing from the days ahead, except confirmation of what he already believed. That people performed kindness without meaning it, offered affection without substance behind it, and valued his title and fortune while remaining profoundly indifferent to the man who carried them. He had no idea that in less than 48 hours, a woman in a wine-stained dress would quietly dismantle every assumption he had spent years building to protect himself. Thornhaven Castle overwhelmed the senses before visitors even passed through the front gates. The approach road climbed through ancient forest before breaking suddenly into open cliffland, where the castle appeared against gray sky and dark sea like something the landscape itself had produced. Towers of black granite rose above courtyards paved with weathered stone, while enormous iron lanterns hung from chains along the entrance walls, their flames bending sideways in the coastal wind. Carriages from 23 noble families arrived throughout the first morning, wheels crunching across gravel, while servants in dark blue livery directed luggage and escorted guests through corridors wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast. The interior smelled of beeswax candles, aged wood, sea salt, and the faint sweetness of dried heather arranged in stone vases along every windowsill. Cyrena followed her family through the entrance hall in silence. Lord Westcott walked ahead with Lady Davinia, their posture broadcasting importance to every observer. Gervain surveyed the surroundings with calculating eyes, mentally cataloging every rival as they passed. Lysette smiled effortlessly at anyone who glanced in her direction, radiating the particular warmth of someone who believed every room improved the moment she entered it. Nobody introduced Cyrene to the greeting party. She brought her own small trunk to the assigned chamber without assistance. The first evening's event was a formal reception where each family's unmarried daughters would be presented individually before the Duke and his household. Preparations began hours beforehand inside the guest dressing chambers on the castle's eastern wing. The long stone room buzzed with controlled panic as dozens of young women adjusted gowns, argued with maids over hairstyles, and studied their reflections with the anxious intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. Cyrene dressed near the far window. The pale gray silk she had mended herself hung simply against her frame. No jewels, no embroidery, no imported lace. But the fabric was clean, and the alterations she had made gave the gown a modest elegance that suited her. She stepped toward the mirror to check her collar. That was when Gervain moved. The gesture was practiced enough to appear accidental to anyone watching casually. Gervain shifted her left arm while holding a full glass of dark red wine, tilting it with precise carelessness directly across the front of Siren's gown. The stain bled immediately from neckline to waist, dark and spreading and irreversible. Siren's hands froze against the fabric. "Oh, how dreadful!" Jorvain said smoothly while examining a thread on her own sleeve. "Red wine on pale silk. I do not think that will recover." Lysette materialized beside her, fan already raised. "Perhaps you should sit this evening out, sister. The Duke will hardly notice one fewer introduction." Several nearby women looked over. Some wore expressions of sympathy. Others wore relief that a competitor had been eliminated before the evening began. Not one of them spoke. Siren stood motionless for several seconds. The urge to cry pressed so heavily behind her eyes that her vision blurred momentarily. Her fingers trembled against the ruined silk while her sisters watched with the patient satisfaction of people who had already moved past the moment and were simply waiting for her to accept the outcome. But Siren Ashgrove had survived a decade of being dismissed by the people who were supposed to love her. She had grieved alone. She had worked without thanks. She had endured whispered cruelty from strangers and open contempt from her own blood. And somewhere inside the accumulated weight of all those years lived a stubbornness that no amount of humiliation had managed to extinguish. She unfastened the ruined outer layer and removed it entirely. Beneath it, she wore a simple linen underdress, undecorated, never meant to be seen outside a private chamber, without mirrors, without assistance, and without acknowledging either sister. Sirene adjusted the plain fabric across her shoulders with steady hands. She tucked the material at her waist, straightened the neckline, and smoothed the linen until it fell with clean simplicity against her frame. It was not a ball gown. It would draw whispers and stares, and almost certainly laughter from women wearing gowns worth more than most families earned in a year. But Siren wore it as though she had selected it deliberately. Jorvain's expression faltered. Something she had not anticipated replaced the satisfaction in her eyes. Lysette lowered her fan with a movement that was not entirely voluntary. From behind a marble column near the private entrance reserved for the selection committee, Duke Theron Blackmere stood in absolute stillness. He had come through a side corridor to observe the candidates before formal introductions, a habit born from years of evaluating people by their unguarded behavior rather than their polished performances. He had watched the wine spill. He had watched the sisters' faces. Afterward, he had watched every other woman in the room choose silence over decency. And he had watched Siren Ashgrove respond to deliberate cruelty with a self-possession so complete that it stopped his thoughts mid-sentence and held them there. During the formal reception that followed, 63 young women were presented before the Duke inside the great hall beneath iron chandeliers burning with hundreds of candles. Each introduction followed the same pattern. The young woman curtsied. Her father announced her name and lineage. She smiled with calculated grace, while the Duke acknowledged her with polite detachment. Jorvain performed flawlessly. Her curtsy was precise, her conversation sharp, and her political references carefully selected to signal intellectual partnership. The Duke listened attentively and thanked her courteously. Lysette shone brighter than any woman in the room. Her beauty drew audible murmurs from the gathered audience, and her warmth felt genuine even to those who suspected otherwise. The Duke studied her briefly with the expression of a man who recognized a familiar pattern and felt no need to examine it further. Then Siren stepped forward. Whispers rippled through the hall. The plain linen underdress stood in stark contrast to every jeweled gown surrounding her. Several women covered smiles behind fans. Lord Westcott's jaw tightened visibly, while Lady Davinia stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the humiliation she believed her eldest daughter was inflicting upon the family. Siren curtsied simply. Her voice held steady, despite the attention pressing against her from every direction. "Miss Siren Ashgrove, Your Grace." The Duke studied her for a long moment, longer than he had studied anyone else that evening. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on hers with an attention that unsettled several people watching nearby. Later that evening, while guests mingled through the castle's lower gallery holding crystal glasses of imported wine and plates of roasted quail, buttered parsnips, and warm bread drizzled with honey, Siren noticed a young woman sitting alone on a stone bench near the gallery's far archway. The girl was perhaps 19, with auburn hair pinned too tightly and a gown of pale blue that suggested a family of modest means among the wealthier guests. Her face was turned toward the wall, but the trembling of her shoulders gave her away. Siren approached without hesitation and sat beside her. The girl startled and wiped her face quickly, mortified at being discovered. "I beg your pardon." "I am perfectly well." Siren waited a moment before speaking. These gatherings can feel like standing beneath a wave that never breaks. The pressure simply builds and builds. The girl looked at her with surprise that slowly softened into gratitude. She was Miss Annalise Tarot, the only daughter of a baronet, from a declining estate whose family had pinned every remaining hope on this selection. The weight of their expectations had become unbearable over the course of the evening. "Every woman here is more beautiful and more confident," Annalise whispered. "I do not belong in this castle." Siren studied her with gentle steadiness. "You are frightened, not inferior. Those are very different things." They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Siren listened without interrupting, offered no false reassurance, and simply sat beside the girl until the trembling stopped and color returned to her face. When Annalise finally stood to rejoin the gathering, she squeezed Siren's hand with a gratitude that required no words. Across the gallery, standing beneath a stone archway with a glass of wine he had not touched, Theron Blackmere watched the entire exchange. He had spent the evening surrounded by women competing desperately for his attention through beauty, charm, flattery, and strategic intelligence. And here was a woman in a plain linen dress, sitting on a cold bench, comforting a rival, asking nothing in return. He set down his glass. For the first time since agreeing to this bride selection, Theron felt something other than the weary resignation he had brought with him. The following morning, word spread through Thornhaven Castle, with the speed of wind moving across open water. During the first private audience session, where the Duke met individually with selected candidates inside the castle library, only 9 women received invitations. Siren Ashgrove was among them. The news reached Lord Westcott during breakfast. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, while Lady Davinia set down her teacup with a sharp ceramic sound against the saucer. Jovane received an invitation as well, which softened the shock slightly. Lisette did not, and her expression when she learned this fact shifted through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching fury before settling into a rigid smile she maintained for the remainder of the meal. Inside the library, Theron spoke with each woman for approximately 20 minutes. The conversations covered literature, philosophy, estate management, and the responsibilities attached to public influence. Most candidates answered carefully, offering responses designed to impress rather than reveal. When Siren entered, she expected the same formal distance the Duke had shown during the reception. Instead, he asked her a question nobody else had received. What would you change about the way noble families treat their household staff? The directness startled her. She hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. I would ensure their children receive education. Most noble families employ workers whose families have served them for generations, yet never consider whether those families might produce children capable of becoming physicians or teachers or architects, if anyone bothered to provide opportunity. Loyalty should be repaid with more than wages. Theron studied her for several seconds without responding. Then he asked another question, and another, and their conversation extended past 30 minutes before either of them noticed. When Siren departed the library, the senior household steward was already preparing a second tea service. The Duke had not requested extended time with any other candidate. That afternoon, while guests explored the castle grounds, Theron found Cyrene walking alone along the cliff path behind the eastern tower. The wind pressed her hair sideways against her face, and the sea churned gray and white far below. She did not notice him until he fell into step beside her. "You prefer solitude to society," he observed. "I prefer honesty to performance," she replied without thinking, then stopped herself with visible embarrassment. "Forgive me. That was not appropriate. It was accurate." Theron glanced sideways at her. "I have spent the past 4 years surrounded by people who excel at performance, and I have grown exceptionally tired of it." They walked together for nearly an hour along the cliff edge while the wind carried their words out toward open sea. Cyrene spoke about books she admired, about the satisfaction of balancing household accounts when the numbers finally resolved themselves, and about the sound of the fortepiano in an empty room when nobody was listening and the music could simply exist for its own sake. Theron listened with the focused attention of a man who had forgotten what genuine conversation felt like and was remembering in real time. She never once mentioned his estates, his political influence, or his wealth. The omission struck him with unexpected force. Every other woman he had spoken to across 2 days had found a way to reference his position within the first 5 minutes of conversation. Cyrene discussed ideas as though the man beside her possessed nothing more remarkable than an interesting mind. By the time they returned to the castle, servants along the corridor had already noticed the duration of their walk. News traveled through the household within the hour. By evening, the castle hummed with speculation. Rival families adjusted strategies, and inside the Ashgrove guest chambers, the atmosphere transformed completely. Lady Davinia appeared at Cyrene's door, holding a velvet-wrapped package containing an emerald green gown she had originally commissioned for Lysette. "You will wear this for tomorrow evening's dinner," she announced, with a warmth so sudden it felt almost disorienting. "I have also arranged for the castle's seamstress to adjust the measurements tonight." Cyrene stared at the gown. For years her mother had not spent a single coin on her wardrobe. Now imported silk appeared at her doorstep as though the previous decade of neglect had never occurred. Lord Westcott's behavior shifted even more dramatically. During the afternoon garden walk organized for guests, he positioned himself beside Cyrene and introduced her personally to 3 visiting lords as my eldest daughter, as though those words had always come naturally to him. His hand rested briefly against her shoulder in a gesture of paternal pride so unfamiliar that Cyrene nearly flinched from the contact. That evening, while Cyrene sat alone inside her chamber, processing the bewildering change in her family's behavior, Nella arrived with warm broth and a knowing expression.
"They smell opportunity,"
the old maid said while setting the tray beside the window. "Your father ignored you for years. Now the most powerful duke in England has shown interest, and suddenly, you are precious." Cyrene stared at the emerald gown draped across the chair. "I should feel grateful." "You should feel cautious," Nella replied. "Affection that arrives only when it is useful is not affection. It is investment." The words settled heavily because Cyrene recognized their truth immediately. Meanwhile, inside Jorvain's chamber, 2 corridors away, fury built with controlled precision. Jorvain sat before her writing desk, composing a letter, while Lisette paced behind her, arms folded tightly across her chest. "He barely looked at me during the reception," Lisette hissed. "I wore the finest gown in that hall." Every other man in the room watched me constantly, yet the Duke looked at me as though I were furniture. Jorvain did not look up from her writing. "Because you offered him exactly what every other woman offered, charm without depth. He has grown immune to surfaces." "Then how did she capture his attention?" Lysette demanded. "She wore a linen underdress. She possesses nothing remarkable." Jorvain set down her pen. "That is precisely what we need to determine." At Ashgrove Hall, Malus received word of developments through a letter from Lady Davinia. She read it alone inside the drawing room of Lord Fenwick's estate, while her husband dined separately in his study for the fourth consecutive evening. Her fingers tightened against the paper until creases formed across the words. The sister who had been dismissed, pitied, and treated as the family's permanent disappointment was being courted by the wealthiest duke in England. While Malis sat inside an empty house, married to a man who had not asked about her day in over 7 months. She folded the letter carefully and reached for the file of notes she had compiled weeks earlier about the Duke's personal history. Then she began composing a response to Jorvain. The second day of the bride selection brought a formal supper inside Thornhaven's great dining hall, where long oak tables stretched beneath vaulted stone ceilings, and firelight from 6 enormous hearths cast moving shadows across walls lined with ancestral tapestries. Silver platters held roasted venison glazed with juniper, creamed leeks, buttered potatoes, poached pears and spiced wine, and warm bread served with salted butter and honeycomb. The scent alone overwhelmed visitors unaccustomed to the scale of Blackmere hospitality. Cyrene wore the emerald gown her mother had provided. The color suited her more than Lady Davinia had anticipated, and several guests who had dismissed her the previous evening now studied her with recalibrated interest. The woman in servant's linen had been replaced by someone unexpectedly striking, and the transformation unsettled those who preferred their assumptions unchallenged. Theron seated Cyrene closer to the head of the table than protocol required. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with aristocratic dining customs. Jorvain noticed immediately. Lysette noticed seconds later. Across the hall, rival families exchanged glances, sharp enough to cut glass. During supper, Theron engaged Cyrene in conversation about music, asking whether she still played the fortepiano. The question surprised her, because she had not mentioned music during their library session. "I used to play regularly," she answered carefully. "Less so in recent years. Why did you stop?" The question pressed against something Cyrene kept carefully guarded. She paused before answering. "I suppose the audience disappeared." A faint smile crossed his face, so brief that only Cyrene was close enough to notice it. "Perhaps you were performing for the wrong audience." Several seats away, Jorvain smiled through the exchange with rigid composure, while her fork pressed hard enough against her plate to leave a visible scratch across the porcelain. That night, after guests retired, Jorvain and Lysette met inside Lysette's chamber with the door locked. The conversation lasted nearly an hour and produced a plan built from desperation disguised as strategy. The following morning, a letter was dispatched from Thornhaven Castle by private courier. It was not addressed to Ashgrove Hall. It was addressed to a London townhouse belonging to Lady Rosabelle Van Trass. Jorvain had obtained the details of Rosabelle's history with the Duke from Malis, who had compiled the information weeks earlier from politically connected friends within Lord Fenwick's circle. The former fiancé's name held exactly the kind of disruptive power the sisters needed. Rosabelle arrived at Thornhaven Castle on the afternoon of the second day, uninvited by the Duke but presenting a personal letter from Jorvain Ashgrove welcoming her as a guest of the Ashgrove family. She wore deep burgundy velvet trimmed with gold thread, and her entrance through the castle's main corridor turned every head within sight. Theron learned of her presence within the hour. His expression when informed revealed nothing, but the steward who delivered the news later told the kitchen staff that the silence which followed his words lasted long enough to become deeply uncomfortable. That evening, Rosabelle appeared at the informal gathering held inside the castle's long gallery. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of a woman accustomed to commanding attention, greeting guests warmly while positioning herself with casual precision along the path the Duke was most likely to walk. When Theron entered the gallery, Rosabelle approached him directly. Her expression blended practiced warmth with calculated vulnerability, a combination she had once deployed to devastating effect. "I hope my presence is not unwelcome," she said softly. "I heard about the selection and simply wish to see you again. Time has given me perspective I did not possess before." Theron regarded her with the focused calm of a man examining a contract he had already identified as fraudulent. He studied her face for several seconds before responding. Perspective, he repeated. An interesting quality. To develop after the need for deception has passed. Rosabel's composure flickered. She recovered with a soft laugh, but the sound rang hollow against the stone walls. People do change, Theron. Some do. He paused. Others simply refine their methods. He turned away without excusing himself. Rosabel remained standing in the center of the gallery, with her wine glass held perfectly steady and her face arranged in an expression of mild amusement. But her free hand, hidden against the folds of her gown, trembled slightly. Later that evening, while guests moved between the gallery and the adjoining music room, Theron passed through the corridor leading toward his private study. Raised voices from behind a partially closed door stopped him mid-stride. Jorvain's voice was clearly audible through the gap. Rosabel's presence alone should be sufficient to remind him what caliber of woman he belongs beside. Once he compares Sirene against someone genuinely refined, the fascination will collapse on its own. Lisette added quickly, and even if Rosabel fails, the rumors we discussed should reach him by tomorrow. A woman approaching 30 who was previously entangled with a common physician is hardly Duchess material once society learns the details. Jorvain continued, her tone hardening. She has manipulated his sympathy deliberately. A conveniently ruined gown, conveniently humble behavior. He is being managed by a woman pretending to be helpless, and he is too blinded by novelty to recognize it. The door opened before either sister could speak again. Theron stood in the doorway. The silence that followed lasted long enough for both women to understand completely that every word had been heard. Jorvain's face lost all color. Lisette stepped backward involuntarily, as though the floor beneath her had become uncertain. Theron did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You arranged Lady Von Tress's presence here," he said to Jorvain. It was not a question. Jorvain opened her mouth but produced no sound. "You intend to spread falsehoods about your own sister's private history to destroy her reputation before my household and guests." Lisette's hand shook against her skirt. "And you destroyed her gown before the reception deliberately, believing I would not discover who was responsible." He paused. "I watched it happen personally." The words landed with the weight of verdicts delivered in courtrooms. Jorvain's composure, built over years of strategic social performance, fractured visibly. Lisette looked as though she might collapse. Theron stepped forward, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge that cut through the room with surgical precision. "Miss Sirene Ashgrove endured calculated humiliation from her own family inside my household, while conducting herself with more grace and integrity than anyone else present across 2 days of formal evaluation. You have confirmed beyond any remaining doubt precisely who in this family possesses genuine character and who does not." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, but no less devastating. "I pity you both. Not for failing to impress me, but for being so consumed by jealousy that you would destroy the one person in your family who has shown you nothing but patience your entire lives." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Behind him, Lisette sank into a chair while tears streaked down her face. Jorvain remained standing, but her reflection in the darkened window beside her showed an expression she had never worn publicly in her life: fear. 30 minutes later, Lord Westcott was summoned to the Duke's study. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When Lord Westcott emerged, his face held the gray complexion of a man who had just been told his family's reputation balanced on a cliff edge and the wind was rising. Sirene did not learn what had happened until much later that evening. She had spent the final hours of the gathering alone inside the castle's small chapel, a stone room barely large enough for 8 people, tucked behind the eastern tower where the sound of the sea echoed faintly through narrow windows. A single candle burned on the altar, casting unsteady light across walls worn smooth by centuries of salt air and silence. She sat in the front pew with her hands folded against her lap, staring at the candle flame without seeing it. The past 2 days had overwhelmed her in ways she could not fully organize inside her mind. The ruined gown, the Duke's unexpected attention, her family's sudden affection, the appearance of a woman from his past, the persistent feeling that she was standing inside someone else's life rather than her own. The chapel door opened behind her. Theron entered without speaking and sat in the pew across the narrow aisle. For nearly a minute, neither of them said anything. The candle flame bent sideways in the draft from the closing door, and then straightened again. "Your sisters invited Lady Vontress here deliberately," Theron said finally. "They intended to undermine you through her presence and through gossip about your past." Sirena's hands tightened in her lap, but she did not look up. "I have addressed the matter directly with them, and with your father. They will not trouble you further while you remain inside this household." Sirena was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It is not their cruelty that wounds me most." Theron waited. "I have survived that for longer than I can properly remember. What wears against you over time is not the unkindness itself. It is the knowledge that your own family decided you were worthless long before anyone else confirmed it. Every whisper from society, every pitying glance at church, every elderly woman suggesting I should accept my situation gracefully, none of it would have damaged me if the people who were supposed to love me had simply chosen to do so." Theron said nothing, but his stillness held the quality of someone listening with their entire body. Sirene's breathing became uneven as words she had never spoken aloud finally surfaced. "I loved someone once. He was a physician. He was kind and selfless, and he treated me as though my thoughts mattered. My father destroyed it, because the man's blood was not distinguished enough. And then he died helping strangers survive a disease that nobody else was willing to stay and fight, and I could not even grieve openly because my family considered the entire attachment embarrassing. So I grieved alone. And eventually, I simply stopped expecting anything from anyone. Because expecting things from people who have already decided you are worthless is the most exhausting form of hope that exists." She stopped. Tears fell openly now, though she made no sound. She pressed her fingertips against her closed eyes and breathed in long, unsteady draws. After a moment, Theron spoke. "I was engaged once, to a woman I believed loved me. I discovered she had been selling my private business strategies to a political rival while planning an alternative marriage in case my fortunes declined. She told me no single person would ever be enough on their own. That she had simply planned accordingly." Sirene lowered her hands and looked at him. The candlelight caught the tears on her face. He continued, "I spent years afterward believing she was right. That trust was simply a vulnerability people exploited once they identified it. That genuine affection was a story people told themselves to justify arrangements built on convenience and mutual advantage. What changed?" Theron held her gaze. "I watched a woman kneel on a stone floor in a ruined dress to comfort a stranger while every other person in the room chose to protect their own position. And I realized that the problem was never trust itself. The problem was that I had offered it to someone who did not deserve it, and allowed that mistake to prevent me from offering it to someone who might. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full in the way that certain silences between two people can hold more than any words available to either of them." Sirene whispered, "No one has ever understood what I meant before I finished saying it." Theron did not reach for her hand. He did not move closer. But the distance between them changed permanently in that moment, not through gesture, but through the recognition that two people who had both learned to survive alone had finally encountered someone who made survival feel like an insufficient ambition. The final evening of the bride selection arrived beneath skies heavy with stars and the distant murmur of the sea beyond the cliffs. Thornhaven Castle had been transformed for the concluding ball, with a thoroughness that bordered on theatrical. Thousands of candles filled the great hall, suspended from iron chandeliers and arranged along every stone ledge until the entire room glowed with warm golden light that softened the dark granite walls into something almost gentle. Long banquet tables overflowed with roasted swan dressed with rosemary and wine reduction, glazed pheasant, buttered lobster tails served on beds of crushed ice, honeyed carrots, creamed spinach with nutmeg, towers of fresh bread beside ceramic pots of salted butter and honeycomb, and desserts so elaborate they resembled architecture more than food. Sugared fruit arrangements, layered cream pastries dusted with cinnamon, chocolate torts decorated with edible gold leaf, and poached pears resting in pools of vanilla custard covered an entire side table. The scent of roasted meat, melted butter, warm bread, sweet wine, beeswax, and sea air merged into something intoxicating that greeted every guest the moment they passed through the great hall's arched entrance. Every noble family in attendance understood that tonight held finality. The Duke had spent 3 days observing, conversing, and evaluating. By the evening's end, he would announce his choice before the most powerful gathering of northern aristocracy assembled in a generation. The pressure inside the dressing chambers was suffocating. Women adjusted gowns with trembling fingers while maids worked in tense silence. Jorvain and Lysa dressed without speaking to each other or to anyone else. The confidence that had fueled them to Thornhaven had evaporated entirely, after the confrontation replaced by a brittle anxiety neither knew how to manage because neither had ever experienced genuine consequence before. Lord Westcott and Lady Davinia sat rigidly inside the guest gallery, maintaining expressions of composed dignity, while privately aware that their family's behavior had placed them in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. If the Duke chose to discuss what he had witnessed publicly, the Ashgrove reputation would sustain damage that no amount of strategic maneuvering could repair. Malis had arrived that afternoon from Lord Fenwick's estate, ostensibly to attend the concluding ball, but truthfully because she could no longer endure another evening alone inside an empty house. Fenwick had not accompanied her. He had not even asked where she was going. Among the gathered guests, Lady Rosabelle Ventress occupied a chair near the far wall with an expression arranged to project indifference. But her eyes followed every movement near the hall's main entrance, waiting for Theron with the focused intensity of someone who still believed. The outcome remained uncertain. Dowager Duchess Anara sat near the dais at the front of the hall, her posture composed, but her eyes moving constantly across the crowd, with the watchful patience of a woman who had spent decades learning to read rooms the way cartographers read landscapes. She had observed every day of the selection without intervening once. She had watched her son's attention settle, shift, and finally fix itself with the quiet certainty she had hoped for, but never dared expect. Now she waited to see whether he would act on it. Cyrene dressed alone inside her chamber. Denla helped fasten the emerald gown and arranged her dark hair simply, pinned away from her face with 2 small silver clasps that had belonged to her grandmother. "You look beautiful, child," Nella said. Cyrene studied her reflection without conviction. "I look frightened." "Those are not mutually exclusive," the old maid replied. When Cyrene entered the great hall, she moved along the edge of the room as she had done at every social gathering for the past 8 years. She expected nothing from the evening except the familiar discipline of surviving public scrutiny without visible distress. The orchestra played from a raised stone platform near the eastern wall, while guests filled their plates and conversations blended into a warm, continuous sound that filled the enormous space beneath the vaulted ceiling. Then, the music stopped. Theron Blackmere entered the great hall from the private corridor behind the main dais. He wore a dark, formal coat and moved with the composed authority of a man who had made a decision and felt no uncertainty about it. In his right hand he held a small box covered in midnight blue velvet. The hall fell silent so abruptly that the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below became audible through the stone walls. Every woman in the room straightened. Mothers gripped their daughters' arms. Fans stopped moving. Wine glasses paused halfway between table and lips. The weight of collective anticipation pressed against the candlelit air until breathing itself seemed to require effort. Anara's hands rested calmly in her lap, but her eyes followed her son's movement with an intensity that betrayed the composure she wore everywhere else. She had waited years for this moment. She had feared it might never come. Rosabel's chin lifted. Lysette's fingers twisted against her skirt. Jorvain stared straight ahead with an expression frozen between resignation and dread. Theron walked slowly through the center of the great hall. He passed the first table where 3 daughters of the Earl of Westmarch sat in matching ivory gowns. He passed the second table where Lysette watched him approach with wide eyes that held something desperate behind their carefully maintained composure. He passed Jorvain without a sideways glance. He passed Lady Rosabel Vantress, whose confident expression crumbled into something raw and exposed the moment he moved beyond her, without acknowledgement. He continued walking until he reached the far edge of the hall, where Cyrene Ashgrove stood alone beside a stone pillar, holding a glass of water she had not touched, wearing an emerald gown and 2 small silver hair clasps, and an expression of complete disbelief. Theron stopped before her. The silence in the hall was absolute. He opened the velvet box. Inside rested a ring, unlike anything most guests had ever seen. A deep blue sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds set in white gold, designed not for spectacle but for beauty, of the kind that revealed itself gradually, the way sunrise changes a landscape, not through sudden brightness, but through the slow accumulation of light. Then, "The wealthiest duke in England spoke, Miss Cyrene Ashgrove," he began, and his voice reached clearly across the silent hall. "I have spent 3 days inside this castle surrounded by women of extraordinary beauty, exceptional intelligence, and impeccable social standing. Nobody moved, but I did not invite these families here to find beauty. I came here to find something I had lost. All confidence still existed. Character that remains constant when nobody important is watching. Kindness offered without calculation. Dignity maintained under cruelty that would have justified bitterness in anyone who endured it." Cyrene's eyes filled with tears she could not prevent, despite every instinct telling her to maintain composure. "I watched you respond to deliberate sabotage from your own sisters with a grace that shamed every person in that dressing chamber, including me for not intervening sooner. I watched you sit beside a frightened young woman who was your rival and offer her comfort when every strategic instinct should have told you to let her fall. I listened to you speak about household workers as though their lives held the same weight as any nobleman's, and I understood that you meant it without performance or pretense." His voice softened, but remained steady. "And I watched you endure years of cruelty from the people closest to you without allowing it to diminish the kindness you give naturally. That is not weakness. That is the rarest form of strength I have ever encountered in my life." Lord Westcott's face had gone entirely white. Lady Davinia pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. Malus stared at the floor. Jorvain and Lysette sat motionless as tears ran silently down both their faces. Across the hall, Anara's composure finally broke. Not dramatically. A single tear traced the line of her cheek, while a smile she could not suppress surfaced for the first time in longer than she could remember. She had spent years fearing her son would spend his life alone inside this castle, surrounded by wealth and bitterness, and here he stood, choosing someone worthy, with a certainty she recognized because it matched her own. Darren stepped closer. "I do not need a wife who impresses society," he said. "I need a partner whose character I trust completely, and there is no woman in this hall, in this county, or in this country whom I trust and admire more than you." He held the ring toward her. "Cyrene, Will you honor me by becoming my wife and the Duchess of Thornhaven?" For several seconds, Cyrene could not answer. Years of loneliness, grief, humiliation, and the slow erosion of believing she would never be chosen for anything pressed against her with a force that made breathing almost impossible. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, and a broken sound escaped her before she could contain it. Then she nodded. Tears spilled freely down her face while her voice emerged barely above a whisper.
Yes.
The word had not finished leaving her lips before applause erupted across the great hall. It began near the servants standing along the walls, the people who had watched Cyrene kneel beside a frightened boy and sit with a weeping girl and speak gently to every worker she encountered since arriving at Thornhaven. The applause spread outward from them until the entire hall thundered with it. Rosabelle turned and left through a side entrance without looking back. Lord Westcott remained seated, stunned beyond the capacity for speech, but Lady Davinia's expression held something heavier than shock or embarrassment. Her eyes glistened as she watched her eldest daughter standing inside a moment she had spent years ensuring would never arrive. Regret. The kind that arrives too late to repair anything but early enough to ensure you feel the full weight of what you chose to destroy. Years passed after that evening at Thornhaven Castle, and England watched Cyrene Ashgrove become someone remarkable, not because of the title she wore, but because of the way she wore it. As Duchess of Thornhaven, Cyrene transformed the Blackmere estates into something no previous generation had attempted. She established a medical clinic on the castle grounds, staffed by physicians she recruited personally, honoring the memory of a man who had once given his life treating strangers because he believed every person deserved care, regardless of station. She funded a small school for workers' children inside a converted stable building, insisting that every child on Blackmere land receive education in reading, arithmetic, and natural science, regardless of their parents' position. She remembered every servant's name. She visited sick workers personally, bringing soup and blankets through rain and snow when the roads became impassable for carriages. She wrote letters of recommendation for talented young people seeking apprenticeships in distant cities, and she opened Thornhaven's kitchens during harsh winters to feed struggling families from across the county. People admired her, not because she was powerful, but because her goodness felt unperformed. She treated the title as responsibility rather than reward, and the difference was visible to everyone who encountered her. Theron watched with a pride that occasionally surfaced as something closer to awe. The woman he had chosen inside a candlelit hall proved more extraordinary with each passing season, and the trust he had risked offering her was repaid daily in ways he had stopped believing possible. Their marriage was steady, warm, and built on the mutual understanding of two people who had both learned what betrayal felt like and chose to offer each other the opposite. Meanwhile, the lives her sisters had built upon foundations of ambition, vanity, and calculated advantage collapsed with the slow inevitability of structures erected on unstable ground. Malis discovered the truth about Lord Fenwick on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday afternoon, when a letter addressed to her husband arrived while he was away on business. She opened it, assuming it concerned a parliamentary matter she could organize for his return. Instead, she found a warmly written note from a woman named Charlotte, discussing their daughter's first birthday celebration and asking when Fenwick would next visit their home in Derbyshire. Malis read the letter standing in the entrance hall while rain tapped against the windows. She read it a second time sitting down because her legs would no longer support her. Fenwick had maintained a second household for over 3 years, complete with a woman he introduced as his wife at gatherings Malis never attended, and a child whose existence he had hidden as methodically as he managed his parliamentary correspondence. The humiliation when society learned the truth was devastating. Fenwick offered no apology and no explanation beyond the observation that Malis had been a political arrangement rather than a personal choice, and political arrangements occasionally required supplementary provisions. Jorvain's ambition eventually secured a marriage to a rising parliamentarian named Sir Aldous Crane, a man whose public charm concealed a private temperament so volatile that servants in his household resigned regularly rather than endure his fury. On the evening after their first formal dinner as a married couple, Jorvain offered a suggestion about the seating arrangement for an upcoming political gathering. Aldous set down his wineglass with deliberate care and informed her that he had married a wife, not an advisor, and that the distinction would be respected going forward. Jorvain's strategic intelligence, which had functioned brilliantly in social settings, proved useless against a man who viewed his wife's opinions as challenges to his authority, rather than contributions to partnership. Within 2 years, she stopped offering opinions entirely. Lisette's beauty attracted exactly the kind of man it was designed to attract. Lord Mercer Graves was handsome, wealthy, publicly attentive during courtship, and privately consumed by jealousy so corrosive that it poisoned every interaction once the wedding celebrations ended. During a dinner party at their estate, a visiting lord complimented Lisette's appearance in passing. After the guests departed, Mercer questioned her for 2 hours about the nature of the compliment, whether she had encouraged it, and whether she had spoken privately with the gentleman at any point during the evening. Lisette, who had spent her entire life pursuing admiration, found herself trapped inside a marriage where the admiration she received from others became the source of her husband's rage. The currency she had invested in her entire life had become the bars of a cage she could not escape. One winter afternoon, nearly 4 years after the bride selection at Thornhaven, 3 carriages arrived at the castle gates within hours of each other. They bore women whose expensive gowns had grown slightly outdated and whose faces showed exhaustion the powder could not conceal. Melis entered first, followed by Jorvain, and finally Lisette. None of them had written ahead. None of them had been invited. Seren received them inside the drawing room beside a fire that crackled warmly against the sound of wind pressing outside the windows. Snow fell steadily across the cliff landscape beyond the glass, covering the dark granite walls in white silence. None of her sisters could meet her eyes. Melis spoke first, and her voice held a fragility Sirene had never heard from her before. I spent years believing I had achieved everything you failed to secure. I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was, about everything. Gorvain said nothing for a long moment. Then she spoke without lifting her gaze from the floor. I convinced myself that your kindness was weakness, that ambition and strategy would protect me from the life I feared. They protected nothing. Lisette simply cried. She cried the way people cry when they have exhausted every alternative to honesty and have nothing remaining except the raw and terrifying experience of admitting they were wrong without any guarantee of forgiveness. Cyrene studied her 3 sisters. She saw the exhaustion beneath Melis's composure. She saw the defeat behind Jorvain's silence. She saw the broken vanity in Lisette's tears. And despite everything they had done, despite the ruined gown, and the whispered cruelties, and the deliberate sabotage, and the years of mockery that had nearly convinced her she deserved the loneliness they inflicted, Sirene felt no satisfaction in their suffering. She called for tea. She called for warm blankets. She asked the kitchen to prepare supper for 3 additional guests. Then she sat beside her sisters and listened to them with the same steady kindness. She had offered frightened children, overwhelmed strangers, and grieving workers throughout her entire life. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was never the title or the castle or the sapphire ring or the applause inside a candlelit hall. It was becoming deeply and permanently loved for the very qualities the world had once told her were worthless. And England eventually learned what the Ashgrove family discovered too late. That real worth was never found in beauty, youth, ambition, or status. It lived inside loyalty, kindness, and the stubborn, unbreakable strength of a gentle heart. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day.